So in the last module, we had a chance to use some server-side controls in ASP.NET. We tried a little bit of data binding. We tried using a text box and a label and some other features. What I didn't have a chance to show you yet is the different categories of server-side controls that you can use. And there are fundamentally two categories. The first of which are the HTML controls, and the second of which are the web controls, which we have explored a little bit already. We haven't yet explored the HTML controls, however. So let's start here, the HTML controls. These are a collection of server-side controls that represent or give you server-side representation of client-side HTML elements. So whenever you take a standard HTML element on your page and mark it with the run@server attribute, and you can literally do this to any HTML element on your page. You can walk up to an anchor tag, or an input element, or an H3 tag, or a span, or a div, and you can put the run@server attribute on that control, give it an identifier, and then you have a server-side object with which you can interact with the control, change its content, handle events, etc. So it's a convenient way of manipulating server-side presentation, server-side element content, without significantly changing the markup. So one thing I've seen people use HTML controls for is if you have an existing HTML page that you want to programmatically modify the contents of, but you don't want to completely replace all of the elements with server-side ASP.NET web controls, you might consider marking some of the controls you want to manipulate with run@server, just the standard HTML controls, and that'll give you access to them on the server. So what I thought I might do to demonstrate this is go back to a demo that we'd been working with in the preceding module, where we had built up a page with a corresponding code behind page. And in the preceding module, we were just using a text editor and IIS to host it, but I'm going to switch over to using Visual Studio at this point. So I'm going to open it up as a website, and this will let me use Visual Studio's built-in ASP.NET server, the ASP.NET development server, so it's not actually going to be running inside of IIS for this simple test that we're going to do. So here's that page that I was talking about, the page with the corresponding code behind. And what I thought I would do is show you how to use an HTML control to get rid of this inline code markup that we have right here. So the first step we can do, and again, you have many options. There's several ways of doing it, but one approach is to go to the server side, go to the client side HTML element and say run@server. Give it an ID, something you want to be able to refer to it with. So how about ID loc h3 for the location h3 element. And then I'm going to get rid of the dynamic content and leave just some placeholder text to indicate that there's going to be more there when this thing actually ends up rendering. And then let's go to our code behind class. Now what this means is my server-side class should now have a member variable of whose name is underscore loc h3 and whose type we don't know yet, I'll show you in a second, but whose type is going to give us access to properties of this HTML element, in this case in h3. So let's go ahead and open up the code behind and go into our load event handler and try manipulating that h3 element. So I'm going to say loc h3, and let me pause here for a second. Notice that as I hover over that control, it's telling me what type the class is. So here it's saying that's system.web.ui.html control.html generic control. And it turns out the generic control right here is one that's used for a whole collection of HTML elements in the client. So things that are sort of nondescript with respect to their server-side properties. So divs and spans and h3, h2, h1, etc., and a header. All of these are represented on the server by the HTML generic control class, and you'll interact with them in much the same way. So let's go ahead and try that out. I'm going to say loc h3 dot, and then notice I have access to the inner HTML and inner text properties, very similar to the client-side properties. And let's go ahead and set the inner text equal to I was loaded from, and then we're going to pass in the call to get type, extracting the assembly, and extracting the location of the assembly. So that's what we were doing before, but now I'm doing it in server-side code in my code behind and interacting with that HTML control that I marked as run@server in the markup. So here's the new H3 element. Let's go ahead and try running it. And if it works, we shouldn't see any change in the output. It should seem pretty much the same, and indeed it does. So that's good. Okay, so keep that in mind. You can use any client-side element. So I could mark this guy as an HTML element. I could mark the body as a run at server. I could mark the head as a run at server. And you can also use the HTML elements in the toolbox here if you want to. So I could place, for example, an input text element on the form. And I could go and mark this with run at equals server. And now I have access to an input element on the server side, in my server-side markup or code. Again, most often you'll tend to reach for the web controls. So you probably wouldn't start with an input element to begin with. You'd more likely start with a text box. But if you already have HTML controls or HTML elements on the page and it makes sense to mark them with run at server so you can manipulate them on the server, perfectly reasonable thing to do, and you might consider it.